Today's voyage takes me up the Piccadilly line to Turnpike Lane. This is on the northeastern section, known to us transport historian type people as the Cockfosters extension. It lies between Manor House and Wood Green. The line was built by the Great Northern Piccadilly and Brompton Railway, also known informally as the Piccadilly Tube, and it opened in 1932. The Cockfosters extension was one of those big projects that the Underground, then Underground Electric Railways of London, had wanted to get off the ground for ages. This part of London had railways, sure, but it had no tube lines. UERL had introduced a new way of doing things. They owned multiple tube lines, but also bus and tram companies, and what this meant was that they could create integrated transport systems. It wasn't a case of buses and trams competing with rail, but feeding into it. This would become very important in the case of Turnpike Lane, but I'm getting ahead of myself. For years, UERL had wanted to extend the Piccadilly Tube, but the London and North Eastern Railway and its predecessor, the Great Northern Railway, had always blocked any extension north of Finsbury Park. And with fairly good reason. While UERL was all about cooperation between its own modes of transport, it could be ruthlessly competitive when it came to other companies. The London and North Eastern Railway had experienced this firsthand. UERL had extended their Hampstead line to Edgware in 1924, which had been LNER turf. Then they introduced buses following the routes of the LNER's branch lines in the area. UERL were innovators, but they were no gentlemen. But there was a bottleneck at Finsbury Park. The Piccadilly Tube terminated here, as I say, and so too did the Northern City Line, another underground line owned by the Metropolitan Railway. The station was overcrowded, so were the streets outside as people decamped to local trams and buses. The government gave the LNER an ultimatum. Upgrade your service to make it comparable with what UERL are promising, or stop getting in the way. Reluctantly, the LNER stepped aside in 1930 and Parliament granted permission for the Piccadilly extension. UERL had also received a substantial loan from the government on the grounds that in the late 1920s Britain was suffering an economic slump and any project that could provide employment was likely to get the thumbs up. Turnpike Lane was initially a sort of depot for the project. The cast iron segments used to line the tunnels were stored here during construction. Not that this was called Turnpike Lane at the start. It might also have been called North Haringey, which is the broader geographical area where it's located, or Duckett's Green after the park opposite. Frank Pick, the very hands-on assistant managing director of UERL, wanted to really show everyone else how it was done. He was the sort of man who, I imagine, gritted his teeth in frustration at situations like the one at Finsbury Park. The stations along this new extension were to represent the very best in public transport. Turnpike Lane wasn't just a tube station, but it would also include a bus station and tram stop. The tram stop is, of course, no longer there, but it could be directly accessed from the station, and it served Alexandra Palace. The station was designed by UERL's company architect, Charles Holden. This was his most innovative and experimental phase, inspired by modernist architecture in Europe. Turnpike Lane was designed in line with his brick box with a roof style that he'd employed elsewhere on the Piccadilly line. This was exactly what it sounds like. The basic design was a simple oblong incorporating large windows to allow natural light in. In this case, the booking hall was sunk below street level. The blocky lines were relieved by curves, reflecting the image of streamlined modernity that UERL liked to project. And, like many of the new Piccadilly stations, it incorporated a tower which ventilated the station but also advertised it. Outside, on the corner, there was a shelter that included a sign advertising the station. This is long gone, but there's a similar one at Southgate. Pick took a particular interest in Turnpike Lane. The first of Holden's new style of station had been at Sudbury Town, and Pick had not been very happy with that. He considered it to have been botched, in his words. Sudbury Town is considered a masterpiece these days, but Pick thought it untidy. with too many compromises on things like lighting that hadn't been within the architect's original remit. So he essentially demanded a control freak policy where Holden would be in charge of everything and Pick would issue instructions that had to be followed to the letter. He might have been a visionary, but I can't imagine he was much fun to work for. Turnpike Lane was the prototype for this new approach. Everything down to the lamp standards was Holden's work, although the decor was handed over to Harold Stabler. Stabler designed the tiling, which is a warm biscuit colour complemented with orange stripes. Stabler also designed the ventilation covers, which are still Art Deco, but feel a lot more fancy than anything Holden would have come up with. I'm not saying I don't like them, or that they don't work, but they're not in line with the kind of streamlined simplicity that Frank Pick liked. Still, he certainly didn't object to that, or indeed to any feature at Turnpike Lane. His instructions had been followed to the smallest, most obsessive detail, and the result was, in Pick's eyes, the perfect station. Turnpike Lane has seen changes over the years. In 1933 it fell under the London Passenger Transport Board, along with everything else owned by UERL. In 1938 the tram service was withdrawn. In some ways it's interesting that the tram stop was put there in the first place. By the 1930s it was clear that trams didn't have much of a future. Perhaps Pick figured it could be a bus stop or even a trolleybus stop in the future. But on the whole, Turnpike Lane is the same station it's always been. It's now a listed building. You can see that there have been modern additions to the buildings around, but what I rather like is that they've been done in line with the old station. Yet at the same time they do their own thing, they're not enslaved to Holden's design or the principles of the 1930s. Good job, architects. Turnpike Lane was intended to be a beacon, a masterpiece of transport design for the world to see and marvel at. Whether it is or not, I'm not really in a position to say. I don't use it regularly. One thing I would say is that it was clearly designed in an era when disability access was not a priority. This aside, though, there is no denying that it is a very good tube station that is, from my casual perspective, easy to use and pleasing to the eye. Which, for a station that's substantially as it was 90 years ago, is very impressive. Well, I hope you enjoyed this micromanaged tale from the tube. If you did, please do leave a like and consider subscribing for more. If you do use the station regularly, I'd be interested to read your comments. Is it as user-friendly as it appears? As ever, I'd like to thank my donors on Ko-fi and Patreon. You are the Stabler tiles to my Holden design. And I'll see you all again very soon for another tale from the tube.